she cut out her tongue. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. With a knife, in a cave at the bottom of the sea, while the blood spread dark through the water around her, in exchange for legs. And the man she did it for never knew her name, never knew what she gave up, never thought to ask. He was busy falling in love with someone else, someone who hadn't sacrificed anything, someone who still had her voice, someone who had simply been standing in the right place at the right moment when he opened his eyes on a beach and decided that was the face he wanted to see for the rest of his life. You think you know this story. A mermaid, a prince, a sea witch with an agenda, a voice stolen and recovered, love that triumphs over magic and distance, and the fundamental incompatibility of two people who were not built for the same world. You think you know how it ends. You don't. The story most people know. The one with the red hair and the rebellious streak and the wedding on the ship and the fireworks. That story was written in 1989 by a studio that looked at what Hans Christian Andersen actually wrote and decided, collectively, that the world was not ready to give it to their children unchanged. They were probably right, because what Andersen actually wrote is not a love story. It is not an adventure. It is not a celebration of following your dreams or finding your voice or believing that the right person will eventually see you for who you are. What Andersen actually wrote is a story about a girl who gave everything she had, her voice, her family, her body, her world, 300 years of life, for a man who was never going to choose her, who stood over that man with a knife while he slept and chose his life over her own, who dissolved into sea foam at dawn, having received nothing in return for everything she sacrificed. And he wrote it 1 year after the man he loved married someone else. This is not a children's story. It was never a children's story. It is a wound dressed up in scales and sea foam and the particular cruelty of a beautiful setting, and Andersen sent it out into the world, knowing exactly what it was, knowing that the people who needed to understand it would understand it, and knowing that everyone else would call it magical and read it to their children at bedtime and never once look at what was underneath. By the time I'm done, you will understand what was underneath, and the story will never look the same again. Before we talk about the mermaid, we need to talk about the man who created her. Because you cannot fully understand what this story is until you understand what it cost him to write it and why he wrote it at all. Hans Christian Andersen was born in 1805 in Odense, Denmark, to a washerwoman and a shoemaker who died when Andersen was 11 years old. He was poor in the way that shapes a person permanently, not just financially poor, but socially poor, positioned so far outside the world he wanted to inhabit that the distance must have felt, at times, like a physical weight. He was tall and awkward and intensely sensitive, with a face he described in his own letters as difficult to look at and mannerisms that the polished, educated society he desperately wanted to belong to found strange and excessive and too much. But he could write. He could write in the way that only people who have never fully belonged anywhere can write, with the particular clarity of someone watching the world from slightly outside it, close enough to see everything, far enough away that the seeing never stops hurting. He moved to Copenhagen as a teenager with almost nothing. He wrote plays and poems and novels and stories. He found patrons, people with money and education and social position, who recognized something in him and chose to support it, which is its own complicated kind of relationship, being supported by someone whose world you want and whose support reminds you constantly that you have not yet earned entry into it on your own terms. One of those patrons was a man named Jonas Collin, and Jonas Collin had a son named Edvard. Edvard Collin was everything Andersen was not. Composed where Andersen was excessive, reserved where Andersen was effusive. Socially at ease in the rooms that made Andersen feel like an imposter. He was educated and steady, and the kind of person who moves through the world without appearing to struggle with it. And Andersen, who struggled with everything, found him extraordinary. He fell in love with him. This is documented, not interpreted, not read between the lines, not a modern projection onto a historical friendship. Andersen's letters to Edvard Collin, which survive, which have been studied by scholars for nearly 2 centuries, are the letters of a man in love. He wrote about longing for Edvard with an intensity that the formal language of the period could barely contain. He used the intimate form of address in Danish, the du, the you that implies closeness, equality, the particular grammar of people who have chosen each other, and Edvard refused it, wrote back in the formal register. Maintain the distance, Andersen kept trying to close. Whether Edvard understood the full nature of what Andersen felt, whether he understood and chose not to acknowledge it, whether the social and religious codes of 1830s, Denmark made that understanding impossible to act on, even if it existed, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that Andersen loved him, and that love was not returned in the form he needed it to be. And that Andersen kept loving him anyway, kept writing to him, kept returning to his orbit, kept finding ways to be near someone whose nearness was never quite enough, because it was never quite what he wanted it to be. In 1836, Edvard Collin became engaged to a woman named Henriette Thyberg. Andersen attended the wedding. He wrote about it afterward, not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, but with the particular grief of someone who had already known for a long time that this was how things would end and had not been able to make themselves stop hoping anyway. 1 year later, in 1837, he published The Little Mermaid, a girl who loves someone who cannot love her back, who transforms herself completely, her body, her voice, her entire existence to be near him, who watches him choose someone else and stands at the wedding in agony and says nothing because she has given up the ability to say anything, who is offered, at the very end, not salvation, but the possibility of salvation, contingent, conditional, dependent on the behavior of others, and accepts it because there is nothing else available to her. Andersen later wrote, in a letter, these exact words: "I have not, like the Little Mermaid, allowed my life to depend upon the prince." He wrote that as if it were true, as if the distance between himself and his character was something he had successfully maintained, something he could observe from the outside with the clear eyes of a man who had made different choices. Read his letters to Edvard Collin. The distance was not as large as he needed it to be. Here is the story Hans Christian Andersen actually wrote, not the version you grew up with, not the version that ends with a wedding and a kingdom and 2 people who found each other across an impossible distance. The version he published in 1837, in its original form, before the world decided it needed to be something easier to live with. The Little Mermaid is the youngest of 6 daughters of the Sea King, who rules a kingdom 300 feet below the surface of the ocean. She lives in a palace of coral and amber, surrounded by her sisters and her grandmother, in a world that is complete and beautiful and entirely her own. She is curious in the way that people who are about to destroy themselves are always curious, drawn toward the surface, toward the world above the water, toward the ships that pass overhead, like shadows, and the human lives she can only imagine. Mermaids in Andersen's world live for 300 years. When they die, they turn to sea foam, no afterlife, no heaven, no continuation of any kind, just the cessation of everything they are. Humans, by contrast, have immortal souls. They live shorter lives, far shorter, but when those lives end, their souls ascend to something that continues forever. The mermaid's grandmother explains this to her early in the story, with the particular gentleness of someone trying to make an injustice sound acceptable. Mermaids live longer, she says. So, in a way, they are better off. The Little Mermaid listens and does not believe her. She understands, with the clarity of someone very young and very perceptive, that 300 years followed by nothingness is not better than a short life followed by eternity. It is just a different kind of loss. She is 15 years old, when she is finally allowed to swim to the surface for the first time. She rises through the dark water as the sun is going down and emerges into the last light of a summer evening, and the first thing she sees is a ship. And on the ship there is a party. And at the center of the party, there is a prince, 16 years old, dark-eyed, celebrated by everyone around him, with the easy warmth of someone who has never had reason to doubt that he deserves to be celebrated. The Little Mermaid watches him from the water and feels something she has no name for yet. Then a storm comes. The ship goes down in the way ships go down in storms, suddenly, catastrophically, the celebration becoming disaster in the space of a single wave. The prince is thrown into the water. He is unconscious. He is drowning. The Little Mermaid pulls him to shore. She holds his head above the water through the dark and the cold and carries him to a beach as the storm subsides, and she stays with him until the light begins to come back into the sky. She watches his face. She has saved his life, and she is watching his face, and this is the closest she has ever been to a human being, and she cannot look away. Then she hears someone coming. A young woman from a nearby temple, walking on the beach in the early morning. The prince opens his eyes. He sees this woman standing over him. He smiles at her with the smile of someone who has just been pulled back from death and is looking at the first face they see as if it is the face of the person responsible for their survival. The Little Mermaid slides back into the water. She goes home. She sits in her palace 300 feet below the surface, and she cannot stop thinking about him. She goes back to the surface again and again and watches the shore and thinks about what it would mean to have legs, to walk on land, to exist in his world rather than watching it from below. Her sisters ask what is wrong with her, and she cannot explain it in a way that makes sense. Because it doesn't make sense, she knows, somewhere beneath the wanting, that it doesn't make sense. But the wanting is stronger than the knowing, the way it always is, the way it has always been for people who decide to transform themselves for someone who has not asked them to. She goes to the Sea Witch. Now this is where the story becomes something else entirely. Something that the version most people know has almost completely erased. The Sea Witch lives in a part of the ocean where nothing grows except pale, grasping sea anemones that reach for anything that passes. Andersen describes them with a specificity that makes them feel less like plants and more like warnings. The witch herself is not subtle about what she is. She knows why the Little Mermaid has come before the mermaid says a word, and she tells her the terms with the directness of someone who has made this kind of arrangement before and understands exactly what it costs. The price is her voice. Not taken, cut out. The witch uses a knife and removes her tongue at the root, and the blood moves dark through the water. And that is the end of the Little Mermaid's ability to speak, to sing, to tell anyone anything about herself ever again. Permanent, irreversible. The part of her that was most extraordinary, she was known throughout the ocean for her voice, her sisters and her grandmother and everyone who had ever heard her sing, excised and handed over in exchange for a potion that will do something even more violent to her body than the knife just did to her tongue. The potion splits her tail into legs. Andersen does not describe this gently. The transformation happens over the course of a night, and it reads less like magic and more like what it actually is. A body being fundamentally altered in ways it was not designed for, the pain of it so severe that she loses consciousness, in the process so complete that when it is over, there is nothing left of what she was below the waist except 2 human legs that will carry her through the rest of her short life in constant agony. Every step she takes feels like walking on knives. Not occasionally. Not when she overexerts herself. Every single step, every single day, for the rest of the time she has. She dances for the prince. She is extraordinary at it, graceful and light in a way that delights him, and he watches her with pleasure and marvels at how beautifully she moves, and never once suspects that every movement is costing her something she will never get back. She smiles through it. She has no choice but to smile through it, because she has no voice to tell him otherwise and no language to explain what she has given up, and no way to make him understand what is happening beneath the grace he is so enjoying. She is in agony, and he sees beauty, and that gap between what she is experiencing and what he perceives is, in many ways, the entire story. The prince keeps her close. He is fond of her, genuinely fond, in the way that people are fond of things that are beautiful and devoted and make no demands. He dresses her in silk and calls her his little foundling and brings her everywhere with him and watches her dance and tells her, at one point, that if he ever had to choose a wife from among all the women he knows, he would choose someone who reminded him of her. He says this as a compliment. He means it as one. He does not understand that he is telling her she is a substitute for something he is already looking for, that she reminds him of the ideal rather than being it, that in his mind, she occupies the position of the person he would settle for rather than the person he wants. He wants the girl from the temple, the one who was standing on the beach when he opened his eyes, the one he believes saved his life, the life that the Little Mermaid actually saved, in the water, in the dark, in the storm, without credit, without acknowledgement, without the possibility of ever correcting his understanding of what happened because she cannot speak. When his family arranges for him to meet a princess from a neighboring kingdom, and he discovers that she is the girl from the temple, that the face he has been holding in his memory is the face of the woman he is being asked to marry, he is overcome with joy. He tells the Little Mermaid about it. He is so happy that he wants to share his happiness with the nearest person, and the nearest person is her, the one he has called his foundling, the one who has been walking on knives every day to be near him, the one who saved his life and received nothing for it except a front row position to watch him fall in love with someone else. He marries the princess. The Little Mermaid stands at the wedding in her silk dress, on her knife blade feet, and watches the ceremony and watches his face as he looks at his bride and understands, with the finality of someone arriving at a conclusion they have been avoiding for a long time, that this was always how it was going to end. She says nothing. She cannot. The night of the wedding, after the celebrations have quieted and the prince and his new bride have gone to sleep on the wedding ship, the Little Mermaid's sisters come. They rise from the water in the darkness, with their long hair cut short, and their faces wrong in a way she understands immediately they have been to the sea witch. They have given the witch the hair they were most proud of, the hair that was beautiful and long, and the particular kind of beautiful that mermaids care about the way humans care about other things, and, in exchange, they have received a knife. They give it to her. The instructions are simple. Kill the prince before the sun rises. Let his blood fall on her feet, and her legs will transform back into a tail, and she can return to the sea and live out her 300 years with her family in the world that was made for her. She takes the knife. She goes to where the prince is sleeping. His new bride is beside him. He is peaceful in the way that people are peaceful when they have gotten exactly what they wanted, and have no reason to suspect that the world is anything other than what it appears to be. He does not know she is there. He has never really known she was there, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that would have required him to see her as a person with an interior life as complex as his own, rather than a beautiful, silent, devoted companion who asked nothing of him because she had no mechanism for asking. She stands over him with the knife. This man who benefited from her sacrifice without knowing about it, who kept her close without choosing her, who told her she reminded him of his ideal without understanding that this was a cruelty, who is sleeping peacefully on his wedding night while she is standing over him, having given up her tongue and her tail and 300 years of life, and still has not received anything in return. She has every justification. The sun begins to lighten the horizon. She throws the knife into the sea. Andersen presents this as the purest expression of her love, that even at the final moment, even with her life as the price, she could not bring herself to harm him. And perhaps it is. Perhaps that is exactly what it is. Love at its most complete, and most selfless, the kind of love that chooses the beloved's life over its own without hesitation. But there is another way to read it, a darker way. A way that does not require us to see her final choice as nobility and allows us instead to see it as the last consequence of everything that has been done to her. She has been silent for the entire story. Not just voiceless silent in a deeper sense. She has not been permitted, by the logic of her own devotion, to want things that conflict with what he wants. She has not been permitted to take up space in his life beyond the space he assigns her. She has been so thoroughly trained by her love, by her sacrifice, by the fundamental structure of the bargain she made to place his existence above her own, that when the moment comes where choosing herself is not just acceptable, but literally the only alternative to death, she cannot do it. She has forgotten, somewhere in the years of walking on knives and smiling through it, that she is allowed to survive. That is not nobility. That is what happens to people who have spent too long making themselves small for someone who never asked them to. She dissolves into sea foam at dawn. 300 years of life, a voice that everyone who heard it called extraordinary, a family who loved her, a world that was entirely her own, all of it gone, for a prince who went back to sleep. And here is where Andersen, who could not quite bring himself to leave her with nothing, gives her something that is somehow worse than nothing. She does not simply die. As the sun rises and her body begins to dissolve, she feels herself becoming lighter, not disappearing, but transforming again into something she did not choose and did not ask for. She becomes a daughter of the air, an invisible spirit, without form, without weight, drifting through the world without being seen in it. And the daughters of the air tell her that she is not lost, that there is a path to the immortal soul she has always wanted, that if she performs good deeds for 300 years, if she devotes herself to the service of humanity for 3 centuries, she may earn a soul and enter heaven. 300 years. The same length as her natural mermaid lifespan, the life she gave up to become human. She traded 300 years of existence in the ocean for 300 years of existence as an invisible spirit, and at the end of both of those 300 years, the prize is the same thing she was trying to reach when she first swam to the surface and saw the ship, a soul, a continuation, the sense that her existence means something beyond its own duration. She has not moved forward at all. She has just changed the form of the waiting. But here is the part that should disturb you most. The part that Andersen includes without apparent awareness of how deeply cruel it is, or perhaps with complete awareness of how deeply cruel it is, because by this point in his life, he understood that the universe did not organize itself around fairness. The daughters of the air explain that their progress, the 300 years of service, can be shortened or extended based on the behavior of children they encounter. When they find a good child, a year is removed from their sentence. When they find a bad child, one who is cruel or disobedient, they weep, and every tear adds a day. Her salvation is not in her hands. It was never in her hands. In the ocean, her soul depended on a man choosing her. Now her soul depends on the behavior of children she will never know, in homes she will drift invisibly through, in lives that have nothing to do with her own. She has no agency over her spiritual destiny in either world. She is required to earn something she should have been born with, through service to people who will never know she exists, measured by a standard she cannot control. Andersen told this to children. He framed it as, "Hope, look, she gets another chance. Look, the story does not end in pure darkness." But what he actually gave her was a different kind of prison, with a door that might open in 300 years if enough strangers happen to behave well. And he told the children reading this story, "Your behavior determines her suffering. Be good, or she waits longer." He made her pain a lesson in obedience. That is either the cruelest thing a storyteller ever did to a character, or the most honest thing Andersen ever wrote about what the world had taught him that certain people are born into systems that will never grant them inherent worth, that require them to earn what others receive without question, that move the conditions of acceptance just far enough away to keep them reaching without ever arriving. He knew that world. He had lived inside it from the day he was born. He just could not figure out how to write his way out of it, because he had not found the way out himself. In 1989, Disney released The Little Mermaid, and the world loved it, and it won Academy Awards and launched what film historians now call the Disney Renaissance, and introduced Ariel red-haired, strong-willed, rebellious, curious, the kind of protagonist who makes things happen rather than having things happen to her, to a generation of children who grew up believing that this was the story Hans Christian Andersen wrote. It is not. The changes Disney made were not small. They were not cosmetic adjustments to update an old story for a modern audience while preserving its essential meaning. They were fundamental reversals of everything the original story was actually about, made deliberately because the people making the film understood correctly that what Andersen actually wrote, they could give to children in 1989 and call entertainment. In Disney's version, Ariel has agency. She makes choices, active choices, choices that drive the plot, rather than responding to a plot that has been constructed entirely around someone else's life. She is rebellious. Her father disapproves of her fascination with the human world, and she pursues it anyway, not out of devotion to a specific person, but out of genuine curiosity and desire. She makes a deal with Ursula, yes, and she loses her voice, yes, but she gets it back. It is recovered. The theft is not permanent. The sacrifice is not the point of the story. It is an obstacle on the way to a point that is fundamentally different. And the prince sees her. He chooses her specifically, not as a substitute for someone else, not as a consolation, but because he has come to know her and want her, and recognize her as the person he wants to be with. When he discovers who she is, he does not hesitate. When she is in danger, he risks his life for her. The love is reciprocal. The ending is earned in both directions. It is a beautiful story. It is genuinely a beautiful story, and there is nothing wrong with it on its own terms. But on its own terms is not the same as on Andersen's terms. And the distance between those two things is the distance between a fantasy and a mirror. What Disney removed, specifically, was the question Andersen was asking. Not the plot, not the setting, not the mermaid or the prince, or the sea witch, or the world under the ocean. The question underneath all of those things. The question that the original story exists to ask and refuses to answer because Andersen did not have an answer. What happens to the ones who give everything and receive nothing? What happens to the girl who transformed herself completely and was still not chosen? Who stood with a knife in her hand and chose his life over her own and dissolved at dawn with nothing to show for any of it? Who was offered, as a consolation, 300 years of invisible service toward a salvation she could not control? What happens to her? Andersen did not know. He had lived that question his whole life, and he did not know the answer, and he could not write one. So he gave her the daughters of the air and the maybe of 300 years and left the question open, because it was the only honest thing he could do. Disney answered the question. They said, she gets saved. She gets the voice back, and the prince, and the future, and the fireworks on the ship. She gets saved. And that answer is so much more comfortable than the truth that the world chose it immediately and completely, and within a generation, had almost entirely forgotten that there was ever another version, that there was ever a girl who was not saved, that there was ever a story that asked what happens to the ones who aren't. That girl existed too. She still does. And she deserved a story. Hans Christian Andersen never married, never found what he was looking for in the form he was looking for it in. He kept writing 156 fairy tales over the course of his life, many of them dark, many of them ending in the death or quiet devastation of the person at the center. He kept traveling, kept corresponding, kept maintaining the friendships that gave him something but never quite gave him everything. He remained close to the Collin family his entire life. He watched Edvard build a life with Henriette, and remained, always, the family friend, the brilliant writer they were proud to know, the man who sat at their table and was welcomed and valued, and could not have the specific thing he had wanted since the beginning. He died in 1875 at the age of 70. He was celebrated by then genuinely celebrated, one of the most famous writers in the world, his fairy tales translated into languages he had never spoken and read by children he would never meet in countries he had never visited. The poverty of his childhood was long behind him. The outsider, who had pressed his face against the glass of Danish society, had been invited, eventually, into the room. It did not resolve the thing that had never been resolved. There is a statue of the Little Mermaid in Copenhagen harbor. She has sat there since 1913, looking out at the water, made of bronze, the size of a real woman, her tail still intact. She is caught in the moment before she makes the bargain, before the knife and the potion and the transformation, before all of it. She is just sitting there looking at the horizon with an expression that is very hard to read. Millions of people visit her every year. Most of them take photographs and move on. Some of them look at her a little longer than necessary, in the way that people look at things that remind them of something they have not found the words for yet. Andersen knew who would look at her that way. He wrote the story for them. The Little Mermaid never gets a name in the original story. In 156 fairy tales, Andersen named his protagonists, gave them identities, histories, the basic dignity of being called something specific. This one he did not name. She is the Little Mermaid from the beginning to the end, defined by what she is in relation to the world above the water, to the prince, to the bargain she made, never by what she is in herself. That is either an oversight or the most deliberate thing in the story. She came from a world that was entirely her own. A palace 300 feet below the surface, where she had a voice and a family, and 300 years ahead of her, and a grandmother who loved her without conditions. She gave all of it away, for a prince who slept peacefully through her dissolution, for a world that had no place for her, for a love that looked, from the inside, so much like salvation that she could not see until it was too late that it was the opposite. The sea does not remember her. It never does. It just keeps moving, the way it was moving before she made her bargain and the way it was moving after, indifferent and vast and completely unchanged by everything she sacrificed inside it. That is the story Hans Christian Andersen wrote in 1837. That is the story he called a fairy tale. That is the story the world took and made beautiful and comfortable and handed to children as a gift. Now you know what the gift actually was. Now you know what she was actually trying to tell you. She just couldn't say it out loud. She never could.